Hello, once again. I am Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. I'm very happy to be presenting my most timely interview. This was simply recorded yesterday. Usually it takes at least a few weeks to get it online. But this is such a timely and important conversation that I wanted to share it as soon as possible. Today I'm talking to Aurelien Mondon and Aurelien Winter, both co-authors of Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. So we had this conversation, as I mentioned in the interview, on Remembrance Day, Veterans Day if you're in the US, or 11 Novembre if you're in France. We are in the midst of a crisis in our political system, particularly in the US at this moment. This book has helped me better understand some of the movements in the last few years and how people could seemingly get on board with some incredibly troubling, sad ideas, racist ideologies, and authoritarian dictatorship. But I won't say anything more about the current political climate. I will let people be the judges of that as they continue to watch, and I'm sure by the time anyone listens to this, things will have changed dramatically once more, as they continue to do in our current system. But I'll let the authors introduce themselves. If you want to find out more about them, both of them have contributed recommended readings at tinap.org, where you can check out this interview, of course, as well as all of the others. I will say that Aurelien Mondon is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath, and Aurelien Winter is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of East London. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. As I said, this book has really helped me put into perspective a number of important and timely issues that we're dealing with today, literally, and I know we will continue to deal with them tomorrow in the short term, as well as in the long term. Perhaps we could start with the two of you introducing yourselves and saying a little bit about your work and formation of this book.
I'm Aurelien Mondon. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bath in politics. A lot of my work has been on the mainstreaming of the far right. I started working first on France and Australia, then later on I've moved on to the UK and the US, particularly for reactionary democracy. I've looked a lot at populism as well, and the misuse of the concept of populism and how it has kind of allowed some ideas like racism to actually come back to the forefront of politics and enter the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. My name is Aurelien Winter. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at University East London. My work is, broadly speaking, on racism, the far right, and both mainstreaming and violence. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which the far right and far right terrorism figures into more popular responses to or understandings of racism.
Great. Well, I'm excited to talk to you both about a lot of things that you bring up in this book. Let's maybe start with a brief overview. If you could say a little bit, I know it's a pretty new book that's come out recently. It clearly has a long history in terms of the things that you've been studying, like far right and populist movements. Anyone not in a coma in 2020 can see how this would be quite a relevant book for people interested in and concerned with the political landscape. So maybe you can just say a little bit about how this book works and how it fits into the contemporary political landscape, whether it's in the US or Europe or elsewhere.
That's a great question. And it's something that actually we've had to think a lot about, and that we still think a lot about and still kind of discuss in our research as well, in the book to some extent, and in other research we've done together with Aaron as well. Because as you said, you would really have to be out of the loop not to know about the far right, about populism, about these topics, because a lot has been published. It's been widely covered. Not just in academia, of course, but in the media. It's been analyzed. Politicians talk about it. It's everywhere. And so we had to think very carefully about whether we wanted to add something else to, already the dozens and hundreds of books that have been published on this topic in the last 3 decades. And so what we try to do with the book really is to make an original contribution, which not only looks at the far right, but look at the impact of the far right on the mainstream, the impact of the mainstream on the far right, but also the impact of researchers like ourselves and our colleagues on all of this as well. So we're not removing ourselves from our topic of study, and we believe that we do have an impact on all of this as well. And with that impact, we also have a responsibility. So that's what I think we hope the contribution would be.
Yeah, I guess over the past while, we were particularly also interested in the way in which, I guess, different societies, particularly thinking of America and Britain, seem to celebrate the defeat of racism. Mm-hmm. And this has a long history in the post-war period at different stages. And I guess consolidated with the election of Obama. What we tended to notice in this process was a way in which the racism was constructed as some evil of the past, some what we call illiberal racism, mm-hmm. which connected to what is now the far right, or slavery, or Jim Crow, and the way in which discourses which seem to legitimize racism started to push, I guess, new articulations, liberal discourses, liberal forms of racism, and the way in which democracy was also being spun to legitimize, I guess, racist public opinion, mm-hmm. if you will. And how that played a role, even though it would be predicated on the defeat of this illiberal far right, let their ideas back in, often in ways that they would also spin their own racism in these sort of newfangled ways. I guess we wanted to bring that to attention, but also contribute to an understanding of the particular contemporary historical conjuncture that involved a reactionary backlash.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I want to ask you about. Your book presents a lot of really interesting things for thinking about and contextualizing what's going on today, meaning the contemporary climate. We are recording this on Veterans Day in the U.S., Remembrance Day in Canada and Europe, and 11 Novembre in France. And this is, an important day that marks what I think a lot of people would like to think of as the defeat of racism in some way, right? I mean, there have been very clear examples of, Nazism being probably the clearest, where there was an attempt for one race or for racial domination, for white supremacy, as I think we would call it in the US right now. And then that was defeated. And so how could we possibly be dealing with all of these questions? Of course, anyone who's been paying closer attention can understand that, things were not defeated. Racism clearly didn't go away with more contemporary issues like the election of Obama in 2008. But things have definitely changed. And obviously the language, when you think about Nazism, has changed dramatically when it comes to race and the far right. Can you say a little bit about how those changes have occurred and what kinds of articulations are currently happening that might be, I guess, less obvious to people who aren't paying closer attention?
I think it's a long process, and it's an interesting one as well, because when we started thinking about this book, we didn't really see the return of illiberal racism happening that quickly and that powerfully in many ways. So we started working together before 2016, before the election of Donald Trump, before the rise of the alt-right, or before really it became something massive. And at that time, what we were really interested in was the way racism had been kind of articulated in two different ways. One was the illiberal form of racism, which is like the neo-Nazis, the swastika tattoos, the kind of white supremacists, the Ku Klux Klan, mm-hmm. The kind of really kind of extreme violent movements that are, hated by the mainstream, that are denounced by the mainstream. But even far-right parties in Europe, for example, would denounce them, would say, look, we're not racist, we're against racism, we're against the Nazis, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And so this kind of illiberal racism, this kind of very kind of violent, exceptional, happenstance racism that happened in some terrorist attacks, for example, was excluded from the mainstream, from the liberal, and served in a way to hide liberal forms of racism, which happened in different ways, from the far right, which had reconstructed itself, something we talk a lot about in the book, the way the far right moved away from biological racism, from the kind of more obvious discourses on racism to things about culture, for example, or Islamophobia. And we also look at the way liberal racism has played out in even more mainstream discourse, and the way certain kind of forms of racist discourse have become hidden under a veneer of liberal values, such as free speech, for example, or the perversion of free speech, or the perversion of secularism in France, or the perversion of women's rights as well, or LGBTQ plus rights in some instances. And that's what we were really worried about that, in 2014-15, and what we were looking at when we were looking at Islamophobia in particular. But then comes 2016, and what happens is something that I think didn't surprise us entirely, but happened quicker and maybe stronger than we expected in a way, this return of kind of a more illiberal forms of racism to the forefront of politics. And you see that with, as I said, the alt-right, with Trump emboldening racists, retweeting them, Breitbart. You see that in the UK as well with the campaign for Brexit. Mm-hmm. And you see that across many countries in Europe as well, in Brazil. And I think that kind of took us by surprise, how quick it was, I think, and it was fascinating talking about it as we were writing the book and trying to kind of figure things out as we were writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. In fact, I mean, I think as we were writing it, there was also a surge in eugenics discourses and sort of race science, news about race science conferences and prominent figures attending them. I think we always saw what we described as illiberal racism as a construct that served liberalism. It served to conceal or distract from liberal racism, but it also allowed for the construction of liberalism or in liberal democracy as a bulwark against racism. Mm-hmm. And I think that the way you started this with talking about fascism and Nazism is quite interesting, because in fact that is effectively the paradigm in post-war sort of, I guess, far-right studies, that the idea that it had been defeated and this form of liberal or traditional racism had been defeated, and it was up to liberal democracies to protect themselves against this. And what this does in one way is this form of distraction displacement. It does allow liberal forms of racism to either continue and creep in new articulations, but it also stops us from having a conversation about systemic racism. And I think that this historical moment we're in, which I think quite close to the book's publication, we have this massive protest in the wake of police killings of Black men and women, and Black Lives Matter protests and analyses. And we start seeing that the concept of systemic racism being, I guess, uttered in the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we've just come out of a period in which not only is systemic racism being consolidated, but the most illiberal forms of white supremacy are also being allowed in the door. And so that's it's an interesting moment where these things converge. I hesitate to bring this onto the election, but then you have a situation where you have this illiberal racist candidate, mm-hmm. and the liberal centrist sort of opposition is then positioned as a bulwark against him. And so partly this is where sort of we're finding the analysis is both can be applied quite well, but also situations developing and new articulations and new constructions of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for anyone who studies this closely, there's bound to be interesting and really profound connections to the past, but also day to day things are evolving so rapidly, at least with our media saturated environments, where seems to be a new racist statement out in the media that people are talking about or dealing with on a daily basis, and those things seem to morph, within hours. How have you found preparing and writing this book, and then also continuing this conversation, as I'm sure you have, with me today, but with others? How have you found it moving from sort of periodization? So like looking at perhaps decades, but then day to day, we're seeing things. Even today, I'm sure you've seen things in the news about the U.S. elections and things that are going on. Have you found ways to negotiate those kind of big picture versus day-to-day changes in these kinds of articulations?
When you asked that question, it took me back to these moments when we were finishing up the book and then doing editing, about going like, oh, something else happened. We have to get it in. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, because things were changing or we thought our analysis applied to it. But I think, I don't know, it was a very interesting process because in a sense, we were speaking to the present, an ever developing present.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to bring in the history, not to merely illuminate the present, but to show the way in which concepts and our understanding of phenomena, both racism and anti-racism, have not only changed, but the way in which particularly racism, like the far right, and liberals use history to construct, I guess, their own identities, their own discourses, and deploy as tactics. So in a sense, we were operating both in the present, in the past, and the way in which the present uses the past.
Mm-hmm.
So that requires, I think, a lot of changing registers. But I guess one of the things is that I can speak from both of us. I think we're happy to contribute to an understanding of today, but I don't think the analysis sort of ends with the book. We started talking in around 2014, several articles, this book, a few things coming out, and continuing discussion, both with each other, with colleagues we're co-authoring work with, and with podcasters and other sort of colleagues in the field.
Yeah, well, I think just to add a little to this, what we were trying to do, I think, is, as Aaron just said, is write something that would be a bit more long lasting and focusing on concepts, but at the same time, what we try to do is make sure that it was anchored in kind of precise contexts, because what we didn't want to do was just to have broad concepts that couldn't be applied easily, or that would be just too broad to be convincing. And so that's why we chose to have 3 case studies in the book to illustrate in a way the kind of movements that we're talking about and the concepts we're talking about, and show that actually you can only understand these politics if you place them in their context. The far right and the mainstreaming of the far right in France is not quite the same as the far right and the mainstreaming of the far right in the UK, and it's not quite the same as the far right and mainstreaming of the far right in the US. But you can learn from each other, and you can see trends, and you can see how certain things evolved, or certain things kind of go back, the ebb and flow in a way. And I think that's what we were interested in. What really, I think, allowed us to kind of hopefully make it work was focusing as well on a few key themes and concepts that we are hoping can be used as heuristic concepts, as things that people can can understand through case studies, and then take and play with and improve, hopefully, as well upon. And so, some of the concepts we've talked about already, like liberal racism, illiberal racism, and these two articulations, which in a way are two sides of the same coin rather than opposed. Mm-hmm. Things like populism as well, and the misusing of populism, and how we should talk about how we talk about populism, the role of public opinion in that, the process of mainstreaming, all of these things. I'm hoping, and we're hoping that people can take away with them and do things with them and apply to whatever happens next, really.
Yeah, that's an important thing I want to speak to you about. Is something I've been struggling with, trying to figure out how this works and how it should work. I'm just thinking that this is a book from Verso that you've published with. It's well researched, of course, and theoretically rich, and so people who are interested in these kinds of things, people probably in social sciences, maybe humanities, would get a lot out of this. But those people who are maybe even looking at the Verso website, are probably already, if not anti-racist, then at least, somewhat versed in these kinds of discourses and the problematic ways in which populist mainstream representations of people like Donald Trump are present already. How do you think, or maybe you just have broader ideas. I'm not asking necessarily for a prescription here, but what are your sort of goals in writing this? And do you have other goals for people who are not necessarily already reading these kinds of materials? Because, like I said, it's an important book and I think everyone should read it. But I know that the people who are reading it are probably not the people who are going to Trump rallies and voting for new far-right authoritarian leadership. So how do we negotiate these things as academics, and how do you negotiate these sort of differences between your potential audiences and the people who really ought to be learning about this, I think?
I think that's a great question, really. And I think, in a way, I don't think we wrote this book for Trump supporters or for Front National supporters in France or the far right. We're not trying to convert people back, in a way, through this book. This is not our role, and this is not what we see, ourselves doing here. What we try to look at, really, in a way, is look at the people who see themselves as non-racist or anti-racist potentially, but might not see the role that liberalism plays and mainstream understandings of politics, hegemony in a way, play in actually supporting and furthering racist practices and systemic racism, for example, as well as other forms of oppressions, in fact. So what we try to do is not simply point the finger at the Trump supporter and stigmatize the Trump supporter as this kind of aberration, as this kind of group of people who are stealing our enjoyment of liberal democracy. If only we didn't have the Trump supporters, everything would be fine. Mm-hmm. What we try to show is that actually this is a lot more complicated, and it's just too easy to pass the blame on to someone else. And this is something we criticize a lot when we look at the white working class and the construction of the white working class and the way Trump, Brexit, the Front National, the far right in general is blamed on the working class. And we try to show that, A, this is most of the case not true, in most cases not true, but also blaming it on the working class does a number of things that are deeply, deeply unhelpful. First, it exonerates the people who are actually benefiting from these policies and usually leading these policies. Donald Trump as the the voice of the working class. It's madness. I mean, it's so incredibly patronizing to a lot of working class people who would never think of Trump as their representative. Same with Nigel Farage in the UK, for example, who is again a stockbroker, hardly a working class person. And what we try to argue is that, a lot of the people who support these politics are middle class, are upper middle class. We saw that with Trump. Of course, there are people who are poorly educated, who do not earn a lot, who are, in the demographics that earn the least in the US. But just as much, there are, and sometimes more, people who are well educated who still voted for Trump, people who earn a lot of money who still voted for Trump. In fact, the first exit polls in the 2020 election show that where he really increased his vote was with the people who earn most. And they're winning through that because, of course, Donald Trump with lower taxes is benefit to them, and the whiteness speaks to them as well in his narrative. So in a way, the book is very much addressed at the kind of liberal center, if you want. The people who assume that liberalism is a bulwark against racism, it's a bulwark against the far right, as opposed to quite often part of the problem. And it's been like that for history in many ways. And so we're trying to kind of bring up some of the things that have been studied by others as well, and show that the problem is not just the far right, it's also the way the mainstream reacts to the far right and emboldens the far right at the same time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to add, I agree. I think we're talking to the liberal center, and in some cases, we're also talking to part of the left. Yes, the people we may be speaking to may be anti-racist, but they may be anti-racist in different ways, or anti-fascist as well. We're trying to also articulate a language of racism to look at where opposition to, say, for example, the right can often distract from more systemic forms of racism. And on top of that, we're also speaking to what are popular narratives and discourses, a culture war that people are accepting the more, I guess, amplified narratives from academics or the commentariat about the white working class revolt or the euphemization of racism as populism. And I guess we're trying to critique these in a way so that to challenge their becoming received wisdom. So yes, we may be not talking to every element of society, but we are talking to a very, very popular set of narratives and discourses which have served to legitimize racism and mainstream the far right. And I guess we hope to speak to that. And that's also why in one of the sections we outline what we call the sort of the legitimizers. Mm-hmm. And these legitimizers are not just academics and they're not just politicians, but they're often pop cultural figures now with YouTube channels and best-selling books mm-hmm. that are being read by non-academics as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I mean, you've already mentioned this a few times now, and so I think we should sort of clarify for people who are listening and haven't necessarily read the book, but the idea of popular, there are a number of terms that you mentioned in the book and that you highlight that are, at first glance, they seem good, right? Popular seems to be a good thing. Free speech seems to be a good thing. Liberalism seems to be a good thing, if you're talking liberal freedom, but they have been turned into things that may in fact be quite the opposite of what they seem to be. And so maybe we can just clarify what we mean or what you mean when we talk about populism, popular opinion, and also maybe you could say a little bit more broadly about how things have been turned so that free speech is now, as you say in the book, a reactionary tool, whereas I'm sure if someone on the street is talking about free speech, they're not likely doing that, but it's also been used in a way that allows a lot of right-wing racist ideologues to enter a space like a university campus where they wouldn't normally be welcome, but under this guise of free speech, they seem to get more access to what becomes popular opinion. So maybe you could just, clarify a little bit about these terms and how they're being used today.
This is very much the title of the book, Reactionary Democracy. We chose that on purpose, and it's interesting because we've been trolled about it, like people arguing that we think that all forms of democracies are reactionary, which is the exact contrary that we're arguing. What we're saying is that democracy does not have to be reactionary, but nowadays we've allowed it to be reactionary. So what we're looking at, in a way, when we look at democracy, when we look at populism, free speech, we're not saying that they are innately reactionary. We're saying that they're concepts, and these concepts in certain contexts can be used for different aims, different goals by different people and in various power structures. And what we're saying at the moment is that the far right, in particular, and parts of the far right have been very clever at kind of turning some concepts that we used to think as progressive and turn them into reactionary tools, as you said before. And they're using these tools, they're recreating them, they're twisting them, they're perverting them to use their kind of reactionary ends. And quite often they're using these tools against what their origins were. So free speech, for example, I'll let Aaron talk about free speech, but I'll talk about populism, for example. Populism is a very interesting concept, and it's a concept that I absolutely love, and that I've worked on for a very long time, and I think it's a very important concept, and it can help us clarify politics. But I think it's a concept that has a very narrow, that should have a very narrow understanding. That's very useful for academics, but beyond academia, I don't think populism is that useful as a concept, because it tends to actually conceal things far more than it tends to clarify them. The way I understand populism is, and the way a lot of people understand populism, there's different school of thoughts, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But the way people understand populism in general in academia is the construction of a people, an us versus a them, and then you can add different kind of shades of nuances to that. So, that's fairly simple. The way populism is used in a lot of mainstream discourse, but also at times by academics. There's been an explosion of publications on populism in the last 20 years, and it's everywhere. The Guardian newspaper, for example, ran an entire kind of 6-month series on populism, used it absolutely randomly. That's problematic because they use it quite often to euphemize certain forms of politics. First, they use it to talk about left and right. So, for example, you could have Donald Trump and you could have Bernie Sanders, who are called populist. How does that help us understand politics? I don't think it does really, because their ideology is not populism. Their ideologies are very, very different. They might speak for the people, but many other politicians do. It also euphemizes politics, certain forms of politics. So, for example, if you call Donald Trump simply populist, or if you call Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far-right party in France, simply populist, what you don't say is that they're far-right, they're nationalist, they're xenophobic, they're racist, all these kind of things that actually really define their politics. And instead you call them populists. And populists, well, it's linked to the word popular. And so you tend to assume that they are popular because they're populists. And of course, that's not necessarily true. Donald Trump was elected by 25% of the registered vote in 2016. 1 out of 4 Americans who can vote voted for him only. 3 out of 4 didn't. And that doesn't even count all the people who have been kicked out of registers and so on. Same with the Front National, same with, the far right in the UK and in other places. So it exaggerates their democratic legitimacy. It popularizes their ideas, even though they're not that popular. And it allows them to position themselves as an alternative to the elite. So they're the populists and they're against an elite that actually today, most people are wary of, at least. Most people feel that democracies are not working well, that we live more and more in technocracies, that there's more and more inequalities, all of these kind of things. And who do you present as the alternative? The far right, who actually usually plays into elite interests.
I agree. And I think that these concepts can also be used very much to, neutralize, euphemize, and legitimize quite negative speech, discourses, ideologies. Aurelien spoke to populism, but the way in which liberal values are spoken of as if they are inherently positive, or at best neutral. They are a bulwark against racism, the far right, and they are something to aspire to. And the way in which free speech is spoken of as something absolute, as a liberal value.
Mm-hmm.
When you start treating these things, so for example, liberalism is a bulwark against racism, but the liberal value of free speech demands that we platform racists. And we see how quickly these can be used to conceal and to sort of bring in these ideas as if they're being managed. So it's sort of like, this idea of the liberal sort of free speech activist saying, look, I'll take care of this one. I'll make sure we manage this. And with the liberal values, the way liberalism can be a bulwark against this, so it can bring it into a university campus in a controlled environment, and we can air bad ideas. And so the airing of bad ideas is a logic or a narrative about, say, for example, education or democratic discussion that seems to imply that if we air these ideas, if they are bad, we'll be able to get rid of them. Yet what happens in this current culture war is the free speech debate gets played out again and again and again, and the point seems to be platforming racists and platforming Nazis. Mm-hmm. And so what I'll often get in discussions with people, and they're going, hang on a second, so you're against free speech? And I will say, I'm not speaking about free speech, I'm speaking about racism. And they will take it back out to the abstract, except what reveals the ideological sort of imperative there and tactic is they may be talking about an abstract, but it always seems to be racism that they want to hear or they want to give a platform to. Now, what kind of also exposes this is that in these liberal societies where people, liberals and conservatives and libertarians, keep on demanding we air the grievances of racists in the far right, you have two things happening. One is and this goes to the public opinion populism issue as well. Politicians say, well, we have to hear these. These are the voters. These are the electorate. These are whoever. And they start legitimizing this on a sort of political policy sort of election and state level. At the same time, you have these counterterrorism and counter-extremism projects coming from these liberal states wanting to defend freedom. They treat, for example, Muslim communities as suspect communities, or they treat Black Lives Matter as a threat, or Antifa as threatening protests and threatening activists and extremists, and bring the full force of law enforcement and the security state against them, while the activists or the commentators who may justify this are also demanding the problem is we don't have enough far-right activists and white nationalists in university campuses and in civil society and in the town square. And I think this is also predicated not on just a sort of the ideology of liberalism, but also a perception or an argument that racism is somehow over and the tables have turned. Now we live in this so-called woke culture, or cancel culture, they also call it, where everyone gets to speak except racists. And it becomes a grievance narrative that we've seen Trump tap into, the media encourage and legitimize. And we have to, I guess part of my point is we have to get away from discussing this as liberal values unless it's a critical approach, or free speech as an abstract.
Yeah, I think you highlight something really important, which is the kind of move back and forth that we've seen in mainstream discourses between the sort of universal and the particular, if you want to phrase it like that, or the abstract and the way in which it's applied. Because, I mean, if you were just to learn English and have no outside context, you just heard these words and what their dictionary definitions would mean, things like pro-life, all lives matter, free speech, how could you disagree with them? Also, what is the opposite of them? Anti-life, anti-speech, or dictatorship, and these kinds of things. And somehow that's been able to get into the mainstream discourses to the point where you can just say these words and people kind of understand that yeah, the English definition of them is one thing, but what they mean now is actually in some cases, quite the opposite. I want to talk to you about the mainstreaming process that you highlight and how some of these really extreme ideas from the far right, in many cases, get into a mainstream discourse where people are just talking about them every day, like as if they were unquestionable or common sense. Can you say a little bit about how that works, as you do in the book, but also perhaps how people who are worried about these kinds of intrusions of really far right racist ideas into the mainstream might be able to subvert that process of mainstreaming these issues, which, you know, in many cases can stand in for racism, even though they seem to do the opposite?
I mean, first and foremost, we want to make very clear that we don't see the mainstream as this sort of well preserved, nice benevolent space in society. And in fact, when we talk about mainstreaming, and we're also talking about the contingency of the concept, like a lot of the construction of the mainstream is somehow liberal, benevolent, and historically safe, often discounts the fact that the illiberal racism or the traditional racisms that we saw historically were very mainstream. I mean, we're not only talking about sort of fascism and colonialism and slavery, segregation, even sort of, systemic racism is mainstream. What we're talking about is also a historical process that treated racism as over and with the far right unacceptable, and then let it back in to the sort of the highest levels and the most sort of popular discourses. I mean, you're talking about a situation where, we've experienced this in Britain, where there almost wasn't effectively a party that was opposing the anti-immigrant, xenophobic, everyday bordering. I mean, you had the Labour Party with, control immigration mugs as sort of, fundraising merch. I mean, there's a normalization and a mainstreaming of these discourses that oftentimes they can be tied to like alleged public opinion and their legitimization, but also continual media scaremongering and legitimization of these type of policies. I mean, in Britain, we had go home vans. I mean, Trump is not, he didn't get there only on his own. And I think that's important to note, but also the fact that when we then get down to, opposing Trump and opposing sort of far right parties and far right ideas across Europe, you have Hillary Clinton saying, well, the left liberals have to get a control of immigration, otherwise the far right or extreme right will get in. And this was also the argument about Biden. So the fact that mainstreaming can also be allowing more moderate versions of this to oppose or fight back the far right, but still legitimizing their baseline ideas.
So I think, in many ways, what we argue is that we need to take a broad view. As Aaron just said, we need to take a broad view, not just targeting the far right as the only kind of site of racism, but also looking at racism in the mainstream and how it's enabled, but also a long view historically and how these things have developed. Because, as you said before, Chris, these concepts, right? Free speech, you were saying liberalism, all lives matter. They're quite hard to go against because, as you say, if you go against them, you seem like you're exclusionary and all of these kind of things, right? No one wants to be against free speech, for example. But this hasn't come from nowhere. And as Aaron just said, Trump wasn't the only one doing these kind of things, and he hasn't invented all of these kind of things. And in fact, what we spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the history of these ideas and how some intellectuals, in particular in France, who then became very influential in the US, and with Steve Bannon in particular, and Breitbart and other circles like that, devised in the 70s and 80s a way to come back from the margins. So, we talked about the post-war period quite a bit already. So post-war period, you get the far right, extreme right, the biological racists are completely excluded from the mainstream. Racism, of course, is still ruling our societies, right? But it's ruling our societies no longer the way it used to rule our societies in the 1920s, 30s, based on biological racism, eugenics is a big no-no, and so on. And so these people are in the margins of society. And they try to do different things. Some of them will stick to kind of mimetic fascism, mimetic Nazism, and they will stick to kind of the old kind of tropes that the Nazis, the fascists had before. But others will be like, okay, what do we want? Do we want to stick to our ideologies, pure ideologies in a way, or do we want to actually gain power? And quite interestingly, they will steal ideas from Antonio Gramsci. And they will take Antonio Gramsci and they'll be like, okay, what does Antonio Gramsci tell us? And in a nutshell, it tells us like, cultural power comes before political power. Mm-hmm. And so what we need to do is win cultural power first. And we can't win cultural power in the 60s, 70s with the students' movements, all these kind of things. We can't win cultural power on biological racism. So we need to change our tack. So they're not changing the ideology, but they're changing their discourse in many ways. And so instead of talking about the difference in races and the superiority and inferiority of races, they start talking about cultures. And they start to say, look, we're not saying there are superior cultures and inferior cultures. We're saying there's lots of different cultures and we should protect them. And already you can see that it's a lot harder to attack them now. In the kind of liberal paradigm and liberal discourse. And then they develop these kind of things, and these kind of things kind of develop along the lines. And, it develops in France, it develops in the UK, in the US, and you get this kind of reconstructed far right, this far right that even ends up denouncing the extreme right and says the extreme right goes too far, we're against racism, we blah, blah, blah. What we want is control over borders. It's not about race anymore. It's about, demographics. So it's about like, the welfare state, even in the end, it's about trying to pretend that they're even left-wing at times, even though, of course, they're not. But you can see how much more complicated it becomes to attack them. And I think what we're trying to argue in the book is that we really need to engage with that, and we really need that long view. It's just not enough to just target the most outrageous racist kind of actions and lies and things like that. We really need to get to the bottom of things, and we need to get a lot more clever as opponents to that, whether we call ourselves, the left, liberals, anti-racists. We need to be a lot more clever with this kind of reclaiming the narrative, reclaiming concepts, not allowing potentially positive concepts to be hijacked by the far right and its enablers, but also not play on their terms. And that's what Aaron was talking about when I was talking about free speech. Today, when we talk about free speech, it's always on the terms of the far right. Even for the far right and the people who use free speech for far right ends are the first ones to want to censor other people, to kind of sue you for litigation, to kind of go running to their mates if they feel that they're being censored, no platform, no anything like that. So I think we need to be a lot more savvy in a way, and that requires thinking, and that requires, of course, a short-term view where we need to fight racism on the street all the time, but also a more long-term view. How do we reclaim the narrative? How do we make our narrative the hegemonic one, the common sense one?
If you don't mind, just to go back to the all lives matter pro-life point you were making earlier, Chris, it's not just that it's positive, it's also that they have control of the language in a way. And this is to such an extent that cancel culture and wokeness have become such common terms that we then have a situation where we have, like, for example, the Harper's letter. People sign on against cancel culture, and then afterwards they're like, they don't realize how much that is a term of a sort of reactionary backlash, or they claim they don't know, and they go, well, I didn't know, it sounded bad. So even when the sort of the reactionary backlash presents concepts which are inherently negative, they're negative about the left and sometimes who they describe as sort of, the left, but they have control of the language and the discourse in such a way that it penetrates, it becomes common terminology and things to worry about.
Yeah, I completely see what you're saying, and you highlight that in the book. As you said, a number of people have been looking at this for a while now, and yet it doesn't seem that any progress has really been made in terms of changing that or countering that discourse, even when power seems to shift. I mean, I'm wondering if we can move to the media a little bit, the mainstream media, if you want to call it that, where I think you are arguing, if I understand, I don't want to speak for you, but maybe you can clarify after, but I think a lot of the terms that we see in mainstream liberal discourses in the media and US and European media will use the terms that work and sort of benefit pushing far-right ideas into a common sense sphere, or at least an assumption about what people think. And yet people like Trump in particular are very good at saying, don't trust the media is lying to you. And also, most recently and most troubling at the moment, which I'm sure, week by week it'll change, but so Trump lost the election in the US. At this moment when we're recording, Trump has clearly lost the election and yet will not concede, because even though all of the media have reported, he says all of the media are lying, and so don't trust them. And yet, when I mean, if I can broadly lump us together as, sort of left intellectual academic commentators talk about the media, we also seem to hate the media in the sense that the discourses that they're presenting are very troubling, very problematic, and really based on a legitimation of far-right power. So how is it that both sides, and I know that's a huge simplification, but how is it that they can both hate or dislike the media? Does the media have no power, or does it have this power against both of us? How can we better understand and contextualize the media in relation to power?
I think that's fascinating, and I think you're really onto something here, and something that we're trying to study in the book and since as well. And I mean, there's a clear failure of the media, and it's quite interesting what you said about the mainstream media. I mean, the mainstream media tended to be criticized a lot from the left, before it was criticized from the far right in many ways. And it's fascinating to see Trump criticizing the mainstream media. Well, it's the mainstream media that has made most far right parties as well by kind of disproportionately covering them, by giving them platforms, by platforming their ideas as well, by discussing their ideas, by discussing every single tweet that Trump puts out. So there's a real failure, I think, of the media, and it's not a failure of journalists, because there's lots of very good journalists there, but I think it's a failure of the context that the media today finds itself in, where it's neoliberalized. It has a feeling that it has to appeal to an audience through a kind of entertainment, and therefore it's chasing stories that they think will increase their readership. And the far right sells. Far right ideas, they sell. They might be terrible. Most of the mainstream newspapers and media, kind of the legacy media, would go against the far right, but they still legitimize it. They still amplify it. I mentioned earlier on the kind of special series that The Guardian did on populism, for example, and they were against the far-right populists. The Guardian is a center-left, center newspaper in the UK, a little bit in the US now as well, and they clearly stand, at least so they say, as anti-racist. But what we argue is that in many ways they play into the hands of the racists. They play into the hands of the far right by covering them far too much, and by covering them quite often in a euphemising fashion, whether through the term populism or by platforming their understanding of free speech, or by creating some false equivalencies sometimes as well. And we've seen that not so much on The Guardian, but we've seen that a lot on public television in the UK, for example. We've seen that a lot in the US as well, this idea that, whenever you talk about racism, you need to have a racist and an anti-racist on a platform debating, right? We shouldn't. There's plenty of debates in academia amongst anti-racists, and we can have great debates amongst anti-racists without bringing racists, to learn anything from them, because I don't think we have to. And the media plays into that because they love the idea of a debate. They think it sells. And I think there's a real lack of accountability today, which is a massive issue in the media, where they just say, well, look, we're just covering what the people want. And that's the same. I think it's Aaron who was mentioning it earlier on. It's the same with politicians. They say, look, we just, the people want anti-immigration laws. That's what Hillary Clinton was saying, for example, when she said, the left needs to crack down on immigration. It's like, it's not what we want. It's what the people want. We have to cover it. And I think this is incredibly hypocritical, and it's incredibly dangerous, because, who chooses what's on the front page? Who sets the agenda? It's not as simple, of course, as saying that the media tells you exactly what to think, but it tells you what to think about. And so if we think about Britain, for example, during the campaign for the EU referendum, immigration was one of the most covered issues. And when immigration is covered, it's usually negative. And so when people go and put their ballot in the box, what do they think about? They think of immigration. It might not convince them to think about it negatively, but at least they think about that instead of thinking about healthcare, pensions, education, jobs, all these kind of things. And, it's the same again in the US, where, the kind of key issues that Trump has that echo a lot of the far right and extreme right there just become very, very prominent. And then, of course, there are the other issues within the media of platforming like straight kind of neo-Nazis, neo-fascists. I mean, the way it happened less, I think, this time around in 2020, but in 2016 and thereafter, the way the alt-right was platformed in the mainstream media, where I think it was in Mother Jones that Richard Spencer was called a dapper white nationalist. It's just mad. I mean, it's like, how can you legitimize someone like him, like a dapper white nationalist, as opposed to, to a proto-fascist? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can have people calling them hipster fascists at one point, and then going, I can't believe Trump didn't denounce the Proud Boys. Even, I mean, who I guess could be categorized under that label. I think, can Trump claim the media is against him and enjoy the benefits of it that it serves him. Yes, in the same way he can benefit from white male capitalist privilege and claim that white male capitalists are under siege or victims.
Mm-hmm.
The same way he can be the spokesman of the working class in many of these narratives. I think one of the issues is, and I think this is part of the critique of liberalism, is that the media can simultaneously legitimize him and give him airtime and amplify him in ways that can ridicule him at the same time. He can become the racist clown, but these ideas are still being circulated again and again and again in the media. The same media that can go, well, he's a racist clown, but the left behind want to speak, or the left behind need to be heard, and sort of this guilty liberal conscience. Trump is simultaneously, and some of the ideas that he represents are simultaneously legitimized and ridiculed. And it's important to know that the ridiculing lets the liberal racists off the hook, but can also serve at certain points, I guess prior to now, his persona or his campaign as an outsider. Mm-hmm. And his curatorial rhetoric. What's also important about that is that he can benefit from something and lose, but if the losing can be spun in a certain way. I mean, I would say this because I'm sort of an avid listener of all the kind of like quite, alt-light reactionary podcasts and blogs and all this kind of stuff. I do notice there is a lot of people backing away from him. They're backing away from him winning this election, and what they're doing is they're often they're still leaving a little hope, but constructing a narrative of his victimization, their victimization, the victimization of that electorate, but also how the Democrats are still going to ruin America. And what's interesting about the liberal media's representation of Trump and Trump's hatred of it, what I think the liberal media does by legitimizing his narratives and discourses and even mocking him, is it ensures in the end one of two things is going to happen. Trump will win, or a liberal centrist with mainstream, with who doesn't address structures of inequality will be elected. And I think that's what seems to be common in this. And I guess this is why we're saying about liberal versus left, is that no candidate seem to want to, that is put up as legitimate, or put up as, is even looking at deep structural inequalities and injustices. It's a liberal gloss of it, mm-hmm. or it's, full on white supremacy. And I think what that does is it limits the horizon of political alternatives. And I think this is how we sort of ended the book, where we talk about the way in which the left anti-racist critique seems to be left out of the political possibilities.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up, a sort of quick question after what you've said, why is it that it doesn't work in the opposite way? I mean, so as you said, Trump can be represented by center-left media as a sort of ridiculous clown, and yet get lots of attention to the point where we're at least thinking about what he wants us to think about. And then the right can present him as, a charismatic leader. But on the opposite side, and I know that, Biden is not the opposite of Trump. As you said, he's probably just a center-right, if anything, by most definitions, alternative to somebody who is, far-right extremist or something. But he's presented, at least in a lot of the media and a lot of the right-leaning media, as both a sleepy old man who's maybe senile, but also a maniacal genius who's going to take over the world in some kind of communist idea. But why hasn't he or somebody like him, or any alternative to Trump or someone, been able to do the exact same thing that you're talking about in terms of Trump, where he's represented and he sucks attention and we think the way he wants us to think, and so left or right, they're both working to his playbook? How come the left haven't had a similar kind of success?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, like one of the issues is that a center-right liberal or a centrist liberal and a Trump are both candidates for capitalism. There's an avoidance of really challenging capitalism and an avoidance of really challenging structural inequalities and injustices. Aurelien pointed this out before about the way in which populism sometimes is used as a term to attack the or to label right and left politicians. The candidates always seem to, and this may be a product of the mainstreaming of the far right or a condition of it, the way in which the spectrum is moved from the center to the far right. And you have two parties, two candidates who don't address structural inequalities and don't challenge capitalism. And I guess that if the right even calls the center right candidate a socialist, I'm not sure what hope we have for an actual left-wing candidate. Now, when we did have a Sanders, for example, just speaking about the American election, there was the issue of electability. And so what often happens in the sort of democratic machine, or the Democrat machine, is there seems to be this electability calculation and this idea that the Democrats are the ones who have to reconcile the spectrum, have to heal divisions, have to meet in the middle, have to attract the people the other side did. And this goes to a lot of the commentary around Biden, including his own healing divisions comment recently on the Democrat side. And then the far right, or the right to the far right, becomes the insurgency. It becomes it represents both the establishment and the insurgency. The way in which that's represented, as well as the media discourse about, what the people want and legitimizing and mainstreaming quite reactionary racist discourses and sort of policy ideas, also limits the horizon for a left-winger. I mean, one of the arguments I find quite interesting is that Biden was the electable candidate. Sanders was not, because he was too far to the left. And that didn't stop the right from calling him a socialist. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to carve out our left-wing candidate and side for this if the center is occupying that position too in the popular discourse.
And I think, just to add to this as well, I think it says a lot about where the state of politics is now and how much capitalist liberalism is running out of steam with the many crises that we have. Think about the environment, but also COVID recently and so on. And that this kind of mild response that Biden embodied that tried to please everyone, as Aaron said, still only manages to scrape through. I mean, the fact that Trump managed to actually increase his share of the vote in 2020 compared to 2016 after the 4 years that he had, let alone all the kind of things that he said, the promises he didn't keep, but also the way he's handled the COVID crisis. And even if he had handled the COVID crisis well, like you'd think that it would have made a dent in his support. And yet it didn't. It's quite interesting because we've seen kind of more radical left-wing candidates and politicians doing very well in certain circumstances. And, in the US, there's a kind of a rise of kind of new, and this, they're not that left as well. I mean, they're fairly kind of safe center left. And we have the same in the UK as well with the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And from the beginning, from day one, Jeremy Corbyn, people were saying like, oh, he's too radical, he stands no chance. And he got the best vote that Labour has had for a long time. And it's a terrible system here as it is in the US. So that didn't help him. And he was undermined by his party all along. And you can be sure that this is exactly what would have happened in the US if Sanders would have got through, for example, in the primaries. It would have been undermined by the Democrats, by the Democrat machinery. And then they would have said, see, we told you it couldn't work. Would he have done worse than Biden? Well, we'll never know. And, I don't want to say like to play these kind of historical games, but that's a problem. It's always a lost cause. The left is never allowed to be radical. The left is never allowed to have dreams. The left is never allowed to want to change society. While Trump, the far right, the Conservative Party in the UK, they're very happy to do that. They just go all out, they lie, they're demagogues. Who cares? Because they also protect certain interests. So that also kind of, have a massive control of the media. If you think about Rupert Murdoch, for example, in the US, and this media machinery that they have is huge. And that's something that the left doesn't have, unfortunately. And also I think the left and center-left parties or the alternative to whatever is on the right these days or the far right does not have the courage to actually shake things up properly because to some extent they're also tied to these interests.
I think, if I don't mind me adding, I also think that, for example, AOC's comment about the left and the need for more radical reform in response to this election was incredible. I mean, as a great comment, it's really important, but the liberal media and Democratic machine are trying to shut it down. I think one, in a sense, for some optimism, there's also those kind of comments and some election victories, but also the momentum of a year of crisis, deaths, and also amazingly important inspirational protests.
Yeah. I mean, it has been, we started off saying with the interview, incredible year, and it's almost like every week things get more intense in terms of what we're dealing with politically. It's exhausting, and it's in many cases very depressing, and yet I think both of you, especially the way that you end your book, is on a note of hope where we can and must be, you say, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-classist, and against every form of oppression. What are your hopes, and what are you perhaps optimistic about as we move forward? I mean, at the time we're recording, it seems that more and more Trump supporters are kind of dropping off in the sense that they're not pursuing what seems, I hope, to be a lost cause about challenging the election results. And yet, of course, there's so much more to be done for anyone hoping to put forward anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-classist ideas. What are you hoping to see and perhaps to do yourselves in your next works?
Well, my hope is not really in the system itself, and I have very little hope that Biden.
This is supposed to be the optimistic part of the show.
Yeah, it is. It's going to turn optimistic, I promise. I'm going to tell you what my hope isn't, and then I'll tell you what my hope is. So my hope isn't in Biden, and I don't think it's in the system itself. And I think, I think it's important what Aaron was saying about IOC, coming out and saying, we need to be critical from the get-go. I think we need to be critical of Biden. I do not buy at all this idea that we need to, all unite around Biden if we more radically left or not. I think that would be a mistake, because Biden's record is not good on many ways. What makes me very optimistic and hopeful is that all of this is contingent. All of this doesn't have to be this way. There's no written rule anywhere that says that we have to have the amount of inequality that we have, that we have to have societies built on systemic racism, that we have to have societies built on systemic sexism, and so on and so forth. These things are not written in stone. They haven't always been around, and they don't have to always be here. They're here right now, and there's power structures that are very hard to shake, very hard to change. But we also see great hope on the ground, like the Black Lives Matter protests, for example, how they spread quickly, the way statues were toppled in the aftermath, the way people started talking about things that would have never made the mainstream news before. I think all of these things are signals of hope, that we are far more than they are, and that we are far more wanting, a better world than we think we are. And it's how we harness all of this, and how we actually bring this to kind of really change things thoroughly. And I don't think it's going to be through this election. I don't think, I hope that, I'm crossing my fingers still, and it's really starting to hurt after so many days since the election, that, Trump will go and we won't talk about it again. But I don't think that will be the end of it. And I think, in a way, if we're not critical from the get-go of the Biden administration, we will allow them to then fall back into these kind of post-racial narratives that we had during Obama, and that led us to Trump. So I think we need to be critical. That's how we can be optimistic, because things don't have to be this way. They will be this way if we let them be this way.
I was thinking of starting optimistically and then moving the direction. Look, I think in a sense we've got to celebrate the defeat of the sort of overt racist white supremacist candidate, and then we've got to critique and organize. I think it's really important, and I agree. I think there's been a groundswell of activism, critique, challenge to not only just illiberal racism, but systemic racism. And that needs to continue to be mobilized and acted upon. I think the greatest danger is celebration followed by complacency. And that's what would occur with everyone uniting and limiting their critique for fear that something bad could happen. And I don't want to take away from the celebrations, because that is absolutely important, particularly to those on the sharpest end of Trump's policies and practices and rhetoric. The families that were torn apart and the people who were hurt and had their lives affected. When I said before about the reactionary kind of sort of vanguard slightly backing away from Trump and talking now how the Democrats will destroy America, what they're also doing is mocking a left or liberals who are turning against Biden. And they seem to be enjoying that, but they also seem to be, I think, scared of it. I think that's why they call him a socialist sometimes, or that the socialist, Marxist, radicals in the party are going to come up. I think in some ways what they're afraid of is that it's going to become more radical than just liberalism. And I don't think they actually think Biden's going to be behind it. But I think it is really important to celebrate and then organize.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more in store for us, hopefully a little less troubling and crisis-driven as this year has been. But I think, I don't know, for me personally, your book, Reactionary Democracy, helped answer a lot of the questions that I was kind of struggling with this year, and I think a lot of people have been, and also provokes more that we can continue to talk about. And these kinds of conversations I love having because they do kind of reinvigorate and engage us in ways that are desperately needed, that we're not getting in most of mainstream culture wherever we turn to that. And I just want to thank you both for speaking to me today about this. It's been great hearing more from you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you very much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Be sure to check out tinap.org to find book recommendations from everyone I've interviewed, as well as more information about upcoming interviews. And please use the Contact Me form where you can suggest books for the podcast. You can perhaps suggest work to further pursue or to check out, and continue to engage with these conversations in whatever way works for you. You can also, of course, do that on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Try to put it all out there because I know different people have different preferences for what they use and where they want to engage. I hope everyone is safe and healthy, particularly in these times, and that you continue to be vigilant both for your own health and that of your community, but also the health of our democracy, which in my lifetime I've never seen as threatened. And I hope we can all get through this together. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.